各位朋友，大家好，今天是2026年7月30号，星期四，欢迎来到每日读报节目，我是龚小夏。今天我们的节目有点特别，参议院国土安全和政府事务监察委员会星期三上午召开的3个多小时的听证会，主题就是新冠疫情真相。证人席上只有一个人，就是疫情期间先是在第1届川普政府担任白宫新冠病毒特别工作组的成员，在拜登政府时期呢，就担任总统首席医疗顾问，他就是 Anthony Fauci， 就福奇医生，大家都听说过了。他在制定新冠政策中起了关键作用，这个关键的是包括这个强迫戴口罩啊、封城隔离啊、关闭学校和教堂、商业场所等等等等，这些政策对美国的影响非常的深远。保守派人士对他力主加强政府控制，否认病毒来源可能是中国，特别是他在中国资助的项目，这些事情早就深恶痛绝。但是民主党的政客呢，多数将福奇和拜登挂在一起，所以表示对他高度支持。而拜登总统在下台之前呢，就给予了福奇以全面的特色。这次听证会场面极其火爆，我们会在下面的节目中呢，为大家选择8个重要的片段。这些视频都有中英文字幕，我会在播出每个视频之前呢，做一点介绍。在看听证会之前呢，我们先来看一篇有关美国打击伊朗新计划的报道。
华尔街日报披露，随着伊朗再次向驻中东美军发动导弹袭击，川普政府正考虑恢复针对伊朗的大规模军事行动，而真正主导这一军事计划的人，并不是经常出现在公众面前的国防部长赫格塞斯或参谋长联席会议主席凯恩，而是美国中央司令部司令布拉德·库珀上将。报道称，上周川普在特拉华州迎接4名阵亡美军士兵遗体返国后，在空军1号上临时召开了一场战争会议。参加会议的包括赫格塞斯、凯恩以及中央司令部司令库珀。过去几个月，库珀一直在佛罗里达州中央司令部总部低调指挥对伊战争。虽然外界很少注意到他，但真正负责制定下一阶段作战方案的人正是库珀。据知情人士透露，库珀已经拟定了一项持续10至14天的大规模空袭计划，希望利用猛烈轰炸大幅削弱伊朗的导弹能力。如今，随着伊朗再次发动导弹袭击，川普将决定是否批准这一方案，或者仅实施有限军事打击，为外交谈判保留空间。不过，国会一些议员警告，任何新的空袭行动都可能让美国进一步陷入战争泥潭。报道指出，过去几周，川普一直在外交谈判与军事威胁之间来回摇摆。一位政府高级官员透露，目前川普明显倾向于升级局势，但仍在考虑报复行动究竟应达到什么程度。库珀认为，过去几个月美军对伊朗采取的有限空袭并没有真正形成威慑，伊朗依然能够威胁霍尔木兹海峡航运，并持续向驻中东美军发射导弹。因此，他主张彻底升级战争，以更猛烈、更持续的空袭摧毁伊朗导弹力量，从根本上改变战场态势。他认为，只要伊朗导弹能力被削弱，美国未来反而能够减少防空拦截弹的消耗，因为伊朗将失去持续发动攻击的能力。不过，参谋长联席会议主席凯恩持更加谨慎的态度。他不断提醒白宫，美国目前防空拦截导弹库存已经明显下降，而这些导弹不仅要应对伊朗，还必须部署到全球其他地区，用于保护美国海外基地及盟友，同时还要应对来自中国、俄罗斯和朝鲜等方向的潜在威胁。凯恩认为，目前库存虽然不足以阻止美国恢复军事行动，但确实会增加整体风险。报道称，以色列总理内塔尼亚胡本周已经先后与川普和赫格塞斯举行会谈。如果美国决定恢复大规模空袭，以色列很可能再次参与联合军事行动。川普本人也公开表示，我们会狠狠干他们一顿，我们会狠狠打击他们。不过，他同时强调，美国仍会继续与伊朗保持接触，为谈判留下机会。文章认为，库珀与凯恩最大的不同在于两人的职责不同。作为中央司令部司令，库珀只负责中东战场，因此更倾向于集中力量迅速击败伊朗，而凯恩则必须统筹全球军事资源，兼顾中国、俄罗斯、朝鲜等其他战略方向，因此更加重视长期风险和平衡部署。事实上，库珀一直认为，只要给予足够时间，美国完全有能力重创伊朗。今年战争开始前，他曾估计至少需要6周才能完成任务，但最终实际作战时间远远短于这一计划。随着国际油价飙升，霍尔木兹海峡局势恶化，以及一架美军 F-15E 战机在伊朗境内被击落， 川普最终选择推动停火。虽然停火后，美国官员宣称伊朗导弹能力已经基本被摧毁，但美国情报部门并不同意这一判断。根据川普今年6月透露的数据，伊朗仍保留大约1/5的导弹库存，而部分分析人士认为实际数量甚至更多。最近几周，伊朗不仅再次向约旦境内美军基地发动袭击，造成美军伤亡，本周又突然向驻中东美军发射导弹，显示其导弹能力仍然具有相当威胁。支持库珀方案的人认为，正因为伊朗仍保有相当实力，美国才应该发动更猛烈的空袭，彻底摧毁其地下导弹基地和生产能力。但反对者指出，美国过去数月已经反复轰炸伊朗地下设施，而伊朗仍不断重新启用地下发射井，并改变导弹飞行路线，配合无人机实施攻击，说明单纯依靠空中打击很难彻底结束这场战争。文章最后指出，目前川普手中摆着2条道路，一条是批准库珀提出的10至14天大规模空袭计划，重新升级战争，另一条则是在有限军事回应之后继续推动外交谈判。无论最终做出何种决定，都将深刻影响中东局势以及美国未来在全球范围内的军事部署。
下面先看看今天的短平快新闻。
在停火维持数日后，中东局势再度急剧升级。伊朗向驻中东美军发动新一轮导弹袭击。美国中央司令部表示，所有来袭导弹均被成功拦截，并形容这次攻击属于一次突然袭击。作为回应，美军联合沙特阿拉伯部队对伊拉克境内与伊朗结盟的武装组织展开空袭。美国总统川普随后表示，美国将对伊朗进行沉重打击，并强调不会容忍针对美军的袭击。不过，美方仍表示不排除在军事回应的同时继续推动外交谈判。受地缘政治风险升温影响，国际油价止跌回升。此前，油价一度跌至2周低点，但市场担忧中东冲突升级可能威胁霍尔木兹海峡航运安全，推动原油价格反弹。美国联邦储备委员会宣布，将联邦基金利率目标区间维持在 3.5% 至 3.75% 不变，符合市场普遍预期。这也是新任美联储主席凯文沃什上任以来主持的重要政策会议之一。不过，此次决议并非一致通过，负责制定利率政策的12名委员中，有3人投票支持加息 0.25个百分点，显示联储内部对于当前通胀形势及货币政策方向仍存在明显分歧。会后，沃什表示，美国通胀虽然较此前高点有所回落，但距离美联储设定的目标仍有一段距离，因此在进一步推动通胀下降方面需要保持耐心。他强调，美联储未来将继续依据经济数据做出判断，在必要时绝不会犹豫采取行动，以确保物价稳定和经济持续增长。受政策声明及主席讲话影响，美国3大股指普遍下跌，投资者担忧高利率可能维持更长时间，对企业盈利和经济增长构成压力。与此同时，2年期美国国债收益率回落，反映市场对未来经济增长前景以及利率走势仍持观望态度。
英国新任首相安迪·伯纳姆宣布，将加快推动英国社会护理体系改革，并尽快完成对现行制度的全面评估。他表示，英国历届政府长期忽视社会护理体系的发展，导致护理服务长期资金不足、人手短缺、护理人员待遇偏低，这种情况令人羞愧，已经不能继续拖延。伯纳姆承诺，新政府将提高护理人员薪资水平，改善工作条件，并投入更多资源加强职业培训，以吸引更多人加入护理行业，同时提升服务质量，更好应对人口老龄化带来的需求增长。不过，伯纳姆也坦言，这些改革需要投入大量财政资金，政府必须做出一些艰难的决定来筹措资金。他没有排除未来提高税收的可能性，但强调政府将在财政可持续和改善公共服务之间寻求平衡。脸书母公司 Meta 公布，第2季度利润为159亿美元，较去年同期下降 14%， 营收增长 28%， 达到608亿美元。Meta 预计下一季度营收将在610亿至640亿美元之间，中值低于分析师预期。与此同时，微软第2季度业绩超过市场预期，受云计算业务及人工智能工具需求强劲带动，利润增长 31%， 达到358亿美元。
欧盟表示，将调查国际足球联合会提出的一项向外部投资者融资的新计划。国际足联因计划出售新成立实体国际足联前进企业的股份，以筹集最多42亿美元用于举办各项赛事，而受到批评。欧盟体育事务专员格伦 米卡莱夫表示，足球毫无节制的商业化具有腐蚀性，这一方案仍需获得国际足联各会员协会批准。
新闻过后，我们先来看主持听证的参议院监察委员会主席，来自肯塔基州的参议员 Rand Paul。他在听证会之前先在福克斯新闻网站发表一篇文章，他誓言说要一层层地揭开新冠疫情的真相。
多年来，美国民众一直被告知实验室泄露理论早已被科学所否定，而这一结论据称已由2020年3月发表的论文《新冠病毒近端起源》盖棺定论。每一个想要这场争论彻底结束的事实核查机构和公共卫生官员都会引用这篇论文。然而，我的调查如今已经通过一份份文件证明，那些兜售这种确定性说法的人自己从未真正相信过它。先从论文作者说起。最新公开的聊天记录显示，克里斯蒂安·安德森私下认为病毒源自实验室的可能性约为30%。埃迪·霍姆斯最初认为概率为20%，后来又改口降至10%。安德森还告诉同事，有一些几乎可以算是铁证的线索，让他无法安心接受自己最终得出的结论。这些科学家公开否定实验室泄露理论，但在幕后却操纵舆论，希望阻止越来越多的证据削弱他们公开宣称的立场。但他们并不是单独行动。在整个疫情期间，这些论文作者始终与美国情报界以及美国国立卫生研究院高层保持直接联系。安德森曾表示，他预计自己会有一位来自情报界内部的联络人。霍姆斯则提到自己在中国有一位消息来源，并称其为我的间谍。当美国国防高级研究计划局的防御项目计划遭泄露后，该计划描述了如何向蝙蝠冠状病毒中插入茯苓蛋白酶切割位点。这群人讨论了有必要不要通过电子邮件沟通，并且应当整理他们之间的通信内容，以应付未来依据信息自由法提出的公开申请。与此同时，霍姆斯承诺他会和情报部门的人聊一聊。这些作者甚至表示，他们需要向托尼在美国国立卫生研究院的团队做出回应。这一切绝非巧合。我公布的文件显示，福奇博士与美国国家安全体系之间的联系最早可追溯至2003年。当时，他曾审阅美国国家情报委员会关于沙士威胁的一份报告。2020年1月31日，也就是新冠病毒近端起源发表前数周，福奇亲自告诉安德森，应当把他对茯苓蛋白酶切割位点的疑虑提交给美国联邦调查局以及英国军情5处。当公众被告知这一问题已经有定论时，福奇本人却在亲自协调安德森与霍姆斯下一步该如何行动。后续文件还显示，此后数年间，福奇一直通过白宫战情室安排接受有关病毒起源问题的绝密情报简报，而福奇自己的日记也印证了这一点。2020年1月26日，在全美国还没有人听说过实验室泄露这个说法之前，福奇就在自己的私人笔记中写道，华南海鲜市场并不是病毒源头，而只是病毒扩散的放大器。几天之后，共有12名科学家参加了后来催生新冠病毒近端起源论文的电话会议，其中只有2人认为病毒属于自然起源。这本日记还记录了福奇私下对生态健康联盟及武汉病毒研究所相关功能增益研究资助问题的忧虑，而与此同时，他却在国会宣誓作证时表示，并不存在此类研究。而与政府保持秘密联系的科学家也并不只有福奇一人。我获得的文件显示，美国中央情报局和国家情报总监办公室早在2015年，也就是疫情爆发前数年，便曾联系美国著名冠状病毒学家拉尔夫·巴里克，讨论冠状病毒演化以及自然人体适应。2020年1月，巴里克向国家情报总监办公室属下的生物科学专家组做了机密简报，并提出病毒可能源于实验室的可能性。而几周之后，这种观点便开始遭到公开嘲讽。正因如此，我已要求美国司法部监察长迈克尔·霍洛维茨调查彼得·达斯扎克或巴里克是否曾被联邦调查局作为秘密线人使用，或因此获得报酬。这是公众理应得到答案的问题。巴里克随后自愿接受了我所属委员会工作人员的正式访谈，并留下了逐字记录。他告诉委员会，在国防高级研究计划局项目中提出的茯苓蛋白酶切割位点研究，许多人称之为新冠病毒蓝图的那项工作，原本就是由他负责实施。而这个茯苓蛋白酶切割位点正处于病毒起源争论的核心。巴里克还证实，他实验室曾进行过一项实验，结果显示，一个最优的受体结合域反而可能削弱病毒，从而削弱了反对病毒人为工程改造的一项核心论据。最后，巴里克表示，他曾参加2020年2月1日催生新冠病毒近端起源论文的那场电话会议，但却无法解释自己究竟是如何参与其中的。接下来就是彼得·达斯扎克本人。文件显示，2021年2月，在他结束世界卫生组织病毒起源调查任务返回美国之前，美国海关与边境保护局已将他列为极高关注对象。原因包括他与武汉病毒研究所有超过15年的合作关系， 以及他在将美国国立卫生研究院资金输送给功能增益研究过程中所扮演的角色。美国海关与边境保护局因此制定了正式行动计划，准备对他进行搜查。然而，就在达斯扎克抵达美国前3天，联邦调查局却通知美国海关与边境保护局停止行动。最终，他毫无阻碍地通过纽约甘乃迪国际机场入境，没有接受任何检查。委员会还公布了一批文件，显示与中国有关联的研究人员曾多次试图将包括冠状病毒样本在内的生物制剂偷运进出美国。仅在今年，就有2名美国国立卫生研究院病毒学家因涉嫌试图将猴痘病毒偷运入境而被起诉。这些案件只不过是过去10年来不断被忽视的警告最终累积爆发的结果，也反映出现代病毒学研究领域中早已司空见惯却极其危险的问题。7月29日，福奇将在我所属委员会依据传票出庭作证。听证会将于当天上午8时30分举行。这场听证会意义重大，但它所涉及的也只是我在这里所揭示内容中的一小部分。美国人民无需等待听证会就可以亲眼看到这些证据，所有证据都已经公开发布在我新建立的网站阅览室上。而当你读到这篇文章时，那里还会有更多资料陆续上传。在全部真相彻底曝光之前，我绝不会停止。
下面就看参议院听证的视频了。参院这次听证呢，从周三早上8点钟开始，有大批人去排队旁听。保罗参议员主持。顺便说一句，保罗参议员自己也是医生，他是眼科医生，动手术的。他听证会一开始呢，福奇就读了一段声明，他声称呢，与他有夙愿的保罗就是想找机会将他关进监狱。
Over 200 times over those 38 years. During and after the COVID pandemic, I have appeared multiple times for hearings in the Senate and the House, usually under oath, and sat for several days-long transcribed sworn interviews, answering questions about the very issues that are now the subject of this hearing. However, given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars, unquote. Any reasonable person who has followed his unhinged obsession with me would readily come to the same conclusion. Therefore, although it pains me to do so, because
福奇在读完声明之后呢，就宣布说，他将引用宪法第5条修正案，拒绝回答任何问题。那么保罗参议员呢，随即就发表了一段讲话，他拿出证据说，福奇公开说的和他在私人日记里的看法并不一致。福奇在任职期间，在公家的电脑上写下了他的私人日记。按照联邦政府的规定啊，这属于联邦财产。保罗在听证会之前呢，已经将这1100多页的日记公诸于众了。
We had hoped to hear testimony from Anthony Fauci today. We haven't, but I think it's important that we do hear from him. So we will have a video we'll play in a moment. For years, Anthony Fauci has been the public face of saying this in all likelihood came from nature. He kept saying, it's the marketplace, it's the marketplace, it's the marketplace. He's been saying that on television up until recently. But what we find is that what he was saying in public is different than what he was saying in private. In January, in private, he wrote that looks like the wet market was a super spreader event. It didn't originate there. We know that some of the earliest deaths and sickness came from somewhere else. But then for years and years, we got dishonesty. So let's play the video so we can see a little juxtaposition of the problem we're dealing with.
are being brought into wet markets. So we have animals that come out of the wild that are sold at these open, what they call them, wet markets. Wet markets, where you bring animals in from the wild who have these viruses. The wet markets in Asia, where people bring animals from the forest into market. There are wet markets in Wuhan that are ample opportunity for a virus to jump from an animal. The origin was from a bat to an intermediate host to a human, very likely in a wet market, and those animals should not have been in the Wuhan market. They knew that those animals should not have been in the market, and they immediately cleaned out the market, put restrictions on the kinds of animals that come into these wet markets. I think I should shut down those things right away. I mean, it boggles my mind.
So repeatedly saying in public something different than what he believed in private. Now, this is interesting because, the first SARS outbreak in 2000-2003 was traced to a wet market, to animals there. But interestingly, they had evidence. They had evidence that the animals had the disease. They also had evidence that the handlers had a disproportionately high number of antibodies to the disease. So there was evidence, and the evidence was presented. So when this came out, the same thing happened again. They did look at the wet market. They looked at the wet market and tested, I think, 80,000 animals and didn't find any animals that had COVID-19. When they did find COVID-19 and trace samples there, they found that the DNA or the RNA was consistent with human spread. This was known not later on, didn't take years to develop, was known in January of 2020. And so Dr. Fauci says privately he knows it didn't come from the wet market, but as you saw, those were over a multi-year period.
福奇在援引了第5条修正案之后呢，对所有的问题拒绝回答了，包括非常简单的问题。密苏里州的参议员 Josh Hawley 就先问他，今天星期几，地毯是什么颜色？对这样的问题呢，福奇也一概拒绝作答。这个律师出身的 Hawley， 他原来是密苏里的那个总检察长嘛，他马上就说，按照最高法院的判例，福奇既然已经被总统特赦，他就失去了援引第5修正案的权利。Hawley 拿出证据说福奇当时动用了8名联邦雇员，到处去为自己申请获奖，让自己得到了100多万美元的好处。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, nothing says honesty like taking the fifth, huh, Doc? Let's try something. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you wearing?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color's the carpet in front of you?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Let's just get one thing straight. You don't have any rights under the Fifth Amendment because you've been pardoned, as you very well know. As the Supreme Court has been clear for a century and more, Brown versus Walker, 1896, when he has been pardoned, he may not stand upon his privilege. You know that. Your lawyers sitting behind you now shifting nervously in their chairs. They know it. This isn't about the Constitution. This isn't about the law. This is about contempt. Contempt for this body and contempt for the American people. But I think I know why you're doing it. It's because you don't want to answer questions. It's because you did all kinds of terrible things. It's because during the pandemic you got rich, didn't you? You got rich. While people were dying, hundreds of thousands of Americans, over 1 million in the end, and you were getting rich, and not only were you doing that, you were using federal employees with taxpayer money to apply for and solicit cash prizes for you personally. Cash prizes totaling over $1 million. You did all of that during the pandemic, didn't you? That's a question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
You remember Greg Folkers? Who was that?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Your chief of staff is the answer. Do you remember Patricia Conrad? Who was that?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
She was your personal assistant. And what were these individuals doing in the depth of the pandemic in November of 2020 when millions of Americans were suffering from COVID? What were they doing? I tell you what they're doing. Folkers was on your behalf soliciting and gathering information for a cash award. Let's look at it. We've got his email right here, right over my shoulder. Volker says, I'm working on this nomination for the Dan David Award for Fauci. We need to beef up the COVID part. Do you have language in the can that you could share that delineates how we responded in new ways to COVID? He sends this to multiple federal employees. What was the Dan David Award? Do you remember, Doc?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
It was a $900,000 cash award. $900,000 cash award. And he got it because he used federal employees to get it. And this wasn't the only award, was it, Dr. Fauci? In fact, you applied for and received at least 8 other federal cash prizes on federal time using federal employees and federal resources. Here they are over my shoulder. Besides the Dan David Award, you've got the Partnership for Public Service, you've got the Adelson Prize, you've got the Smithsonian Award, you've got the National Academy of Medicine's Award, you've got the CDC Foundation. In fact, you turned your staff into a full-time application machine. You actually wrote to people and said, do you think maybe I'd qualify? And you got cash for all of this. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 employees, was it? In fact, you used 8 separate federal employees on federal time using federal resources to solicit cash awards. Isn't that true?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Here they are right over my shoulder. Here's all of them. The people that you use, federal employees, so that you could go and get cash money. And the most hilarious part is that you weren't content to even dragoon them into applying for all of these cash awards. You then had them go out to the ethics agencies and ethics watchdogs and demand that you be able to get the money. That's right. We've got it in your emails. Your staff and employees on federal time, using federal resources, being paid with federal dollars, are soliciting cash for you. And then they're turning around and saying to the agency, we don't want just an answer. We want to get to yes, because Fauci wants the money. He wants it. We want to get to yes, and yes takes time. This is your chief of staff again, using federal email to pressure the agency's own ethics people so that you could get money, so that you could get rich. And it violated the law, didn't it, Dr. Fauci? Didn't it? It violated the law, didn't it?
Is that a question?
It is a question. You can answer. Go ahead.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Federal law, as you very well know, prohibits the solicitation of cash awards or other personal benefits for federal employees. And it certainly prohibits using your own employees to do this. 5 CFR section 2635-205B. It says it right there in black and white. You cannot use federal resources, federal dollars, federal employees, federal offices, federal email, federal time to solicit cash awards. And you did all of it. And the worst part is thousands of people were dying while you were doing it. You were supposed to be the nation's doctor, and you're playing one on TV. But this is what you were doing with your time. Isn't that true?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, I can see why. I can certainly see why. You know what I can't quite figure out is that why you were so obsessed with it, because you're already rich. I mean, and your scheme worked here. I mean, your net worth now is north of $12 million. You got over $1 million in cash awards during COVID, during a 12-month, 24-month span during COVID. $1 million you knocked down in cash money using federal resources. Now you're worth more than $12 million. You've got a pension that in its first year paid out north of $400,000 a year. 1 million people dead, you're getting rich. 1 million people dead, you're using federal employees to get cash awards for you. 1 million people dead, and you're here taking the fifth because you don't want to admit that what really happened in all that time was a multi-month, multi-year course of self-dealing. Isn't that true, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, well, silence is admission. And here's the real thing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just about the money, really, was it? It was really about a power trip. I mean, through all of this, you want to be the most famous scientist in the world. You were so focused on getting every award and every drop of cash that you could, all because you wanted to be on TV. You wanted to be the sun god of science. You wanted to be the guy who was in charge of it all. You wanted to lambast Trump. You wanted to make sure that nobody else stole your spotlight. You wanted to be the guy. You had time to sit for InStyle magazine. Here's what you were doing with your time. You could sit for InStyle magazine, but you can't answer questions for the American people. You could sit for InStyle magazine, but you're here taking the fifth. You could sit for InStyle magazine and get $1 million in cash awards, but now the cat's got your tongue. I bet he does. I tell you what, here's my conclusion from all of this. This was really all about you the whole time. Somewhere along the way, you lost your way. You may have been a good public servant at one time, I don't know. But I can tell you from reading your emails now, from looking at what you did, how you used your employees, somewhere along the line, it became all about you. You became a narcissist and a megalomaniac and a liar. And you've lied to the American people, and you've lied to this body. And you've disgraced your profession by doing it. You called yourself the most famous scientist in the world. You've done more to harm science than anybody in my lifetime. And I hope you'll go home and write that in your diary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
的确呢，获得总统特赦让福奇避免被联邦政府控罪，但是州政府呢却不受联邦的约束，所以呢各州都有权控告他。佛罗里达州的参议员 Rick Scott 就曾经创建了美国最大的医疗保险公司，后来他又当过佛罗里达的州长。他说，福奇的政策祸害了许多人。
Dr. Fauci, I want to close with this. Here's how you impacted my family and people close to me. I have daughters with children. You can't imagine the questions they had around vaccines for their kids and themselves, and the pressure, the unbelievable pressure to make the right decision for their health. I can tell you pregnant women who worked with me were so scared because every time they went to the doctor, they were told something different about taking the vaccine. And you caused this. Imagine being a mom trying to protect their kids, or an expectant mother trying to figure out what to do. Every 3 weeks, a doctor tells you a new set of guidance on a vaccine. The haphazard information you released and pushed on the American people with little research is appalling, and why there's so much distrust in our institutions today. That trust is crucial to public health, and you, more than any person or event in my lifetime, have destroyed that trust for millions of Americans. You lied to hundreds of millions of people amid the worst public health crisis in a century. You failed to follow your own guidance. You forced people to watch their loved ones die alone over the phone. It's disgusting. You destroyed the federal government's credibility when it comes to public health. We have entire generations of Americans who, rightfully so, do not trust our institution to keep people safe because of you. This has destroyed decades of progress and lifetimes of work because you wanted to fuel your own ego and be the center of attention. What would you do differently knowing what you know today, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
All the evidence is right here, and you still can't bring yourself to tell the truth or apologize because you received an auto-pin pardon from a staffer in the Biden White House. If we have another pandemic tomorrow, millions could die because of what you did to make Americans lose trust in their government when it comes to medicine and health care. How many families have you apologized to had to watch their loved ones die alone? You breached public trust, and now you're hiding behind a fraudulent pardon. Your legacy will not be as a man that saved America from COVID, but as a man who destroyed the public trust in America's public health institutions in exchange for 5 minutes of fame.
另一位来自佛罗里达州的参议员 Ashley Moody 原来是这个州的总检察长。 他就专门提到福奇当年对佛罗里达州州长就是 Ron DeSantis 和州政府的攻击，因为呢，佛罗里达是美国就是最拒绝，就是他拒绝封城，也拒绝强迫人民戴口罩。当时我们就说佛罗里达是个自由州嘛，他也称自己是个自由州，就你可以去不用戴口罩。我2021年去过一趟，就的确是在那儿的情况是在别的地方，特别是华盛顿这样的地方见不到的。
Because I believe that the trust the American people place in our public health institutions and what happened to that trust during COVID is important. Because in a public health emergency, they are asked to make extraordinary sacrifices based on advice given to them by the government that is supposed to be working for them. And for that system to work, the public has to be able to trust the people giving them instructions. That trust depends on candor. Would you agree with that, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
And when the evidence is uncertain, officials need to say so. When recommendations are based on assumptions rather than hard data, they need to say so. And when they get something wrong, they need to own it. And when the trust is lost and the consequences extend far beyond any single pandemic, the next time public health officials genuinely need Americans to listen, millions of people may simply ignore them or not believe them. And Dr. Fauci, you were undeniably the face of the federal government's COVID response. You said so yourself in your diary. You said it's not hyperbole to say, I've become the most famous and talked about person in the country. So I want to understand how we got here. Let's start at the beginning. On March 8th, 2020, you appeared on 60 Minutes to discuss the spread of COVID-19. You were specifically asked to clear up the confusion and misinformation surrounding masks. You told the American people, right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with a mask. The interviewer immediately stopped you and said, are you sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this. And instead of walking back or qualifying your statement in any way, you doubled down. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little better. It might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with their masks. They keep touching their face. Just a few weeks later, the CDC released its guidance recommending that Americans wear masks in public. You were asked to explain your original recommendation. You emphasized a very different consideration. You said, well, back then, the critical issue was to save the masks for the people who really needed them because it was felt there was a shortage of masks. So I want everybody to sit with that. The critical issue driving your initial recommendation to the American public was scarcity, logistics, not medical evidence. So when you told the American people there was no reason to wear a mask, what was your principal objective? Giving them an honest assessment of the medical evidence or discouraging them from consuming a scarce supply of masks?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Well, unfortunately, that was just the beginning of a broader pattern. Let's talk about the 6-foot distancing rule. In April 5th, 2020, interview on CBS said, every time I get to that podium in the White House briefing room, I always essentially plead with people. Please take a look at those very simple guidelines of physical separation. And they're very, very clear. Physically separate 6 feet away. Yet when Congress finally asked you in 2024 what science supported that evidence, 6-foot distance rule for COVID, you admitted you were not aware of any studies supporting it. Incredibly, you said the 6-foot rule sort of just appeared and described it as an empiric decision that wasn't based on data. That rule had real consequences. Schools didn't open back up. Businesses didn't open back up. Churches didn't open back up. I could go on and on and on. And Americans were kept physically separated from one another during the most difficult moments of their lives. Many lost loved ones during that time. So, Dr. Fauci, did you have any evidence to support a 6-foot separation rule when you gave that advice to Americans?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
All right, well, let's look at the lockdowns then. By 2022, the consequences of prolonged COVID lockdowns on our children were clear, from delayed development to social isolation, which is probably why you were asked in July 2022 whether you would recommend locking down schools again. And you said, first of all, I didn't recommend locking anything down. But now we have your diary. And it tells a very different story from the one you told the public. And I will quote, I spoke with Bill de Blasio, the mayor of NYC, and convinced him based on what I was saying publicly in my conversation tonight to close the NYC schools. He had already decided based on what I was saying on TV. I went on to tell him he should close the bars and restaurants in NYC, and he said he would do this based on my recommendation. You even said that you told the president we should shut the whole country down. So, Dr. Fauci, how do you square telling the American people publicly that you didn't recommend locking anything down with your own diary entry kept on federal government equipment saying that your recommendation is what convinced the mayor and the president to lock things down?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Now, I just want to make clear that when in Florida, we were pleading with people to give us advice based on scientific evidence, that we were getting these conflicting statements by you that didn't match scientific data. And in fact, when we impaneled a grand jury, the grand jury's conclusion, not surprising to anyone, and by the way, we're still the only state to have impaneled a grand jury. I was the only attorney general to do this. We did this in 2023. That conclusion was the lockdown, mask, and social distancing advice ministered by federal agencies and implemented by certain local, state, and federal agencies was not based on the best available scientific data. In fact, many recommendations and their accompanying mandates departed significantly from available research. Again, people from all walks of life, all political persuasions, that is what they found. And yet, during that time, while you were giving those statements, knowing there was no scientific basis for it, and we know now you knew it because we have your diary entries, you called the governor that I worked with to fight to keep Washington and D.C. out of our state so that we could indeed respect the rights of our citizens. You called our governor, Governor DeSantis, and I'm going to quote this so I get it right out of your journals, a total jerk, that he is a complete disgrace, that he is blocking local authorities from mandating masks in various locations, including schools. And you were very concerned and upset that we were actively, and I'm going to quote, criticizing you, and we talked virtually every day about being wrong on everything. And what is astounding is that you wrote you feared because of that, because we were questioning our government, because we were fighting back for the truth from our government, from scientifically based recommendations, because we were pushing for that. You said you feared that our democracy is in dire danger. Thank goodness we have people up here that I work with that understand our role, which is to report to our bosses, the people, because they are in charge. Calling for our government to be honest with us and transparent with us and accountable to us, that is a democracy.
来自爱荷华州的参议员 Johnny Ernst 就专门提到了福奇和中国各种不同单位的合作关系。对新冠起源呢，他说福奇对新冠起源早就知情。他还说呢，福奇是整个联邦政府中工资最高的雇员，年薪48万，超过了总统的收入。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. Dr. Fauci, Americans haven't forgotten the tragic stories of people who lost loved ones during COVID and those that were denied a chance to say goodbye. to their family members that were in hospitals or residing in nursing homes because of the COVID-19 protocols. Americans haven't forgotten the mandates, the adverse reactions to vaccines, the government misinformation, social media censorship, hotlines to tattle on their neighbors, the forced school closures, the tragic rise in suicides, or those businesses that were forced to close during lockdowns. Americans haven't forgotten the hundreds of billions of dollars spent by taxpayers for COVID relief, stolen by fraudsters who bought Rolls Royces and yachts. These were taxpayer dollars. Americans have lost trust in science and government after the COVID response, trust which will be incredibly difficult for us to gain back. Dr. Fauci, you said that the science was evolving and that your recommendations evolved with it. But Americans remember you as the public face of the coronavirus response. As one of the nation's most trusted voices, you urged policies you said were absolutely necessary, even when those policies came at an enormous human and economic cost. And Americans deserve answers about reports that you may have worked with others to pressure the president into adopting the slow the spread strategy, and why you later sought an unconditional pardon for crimes you may have committed dating back to 2014. Dr. Fauci, in 2022, you had a taxpayer-funded salary of $480,000 a year. You were, in fact, the highest paid federal employee in the entire federal government, even making more than the NIH director and the President of the United States. According to now public documents, that was due in large part to your work on biodefense. Unreported is how NIAID spent over $1 billion from 2009 to 2026 in biodefense and influenza federal contracts and subcontracts. My office uncovered records on usaspending.gov that show from 2015 to 2020, NIAID paid out $515,418 in subcontracts to Harbin Veterinary Institute in Harbin, China, including $100,000 a few days after it opened a BSL-4 biolab in 2018. That very same institute was criticized for doing gain-of-function bird flu research in 2013. And yet you were funding them for years after that, sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to China. These contracts, which we also trace to NIAID, show U.S. taxpayers funded gain-of-function researchers in the Netherlands and in Wisconsin, funding the same folks whose controversial work led President Obama to pause this exact type of dangerous pandemic research. Dr. Fauci, did you know that the NIH's billion-dollar Sears contract programs were funding gain-of-function researchers in China, the U.S., and in the Netherlands?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, Dr. Deborah Birx wrote in her book that you and President Obama's former CDC director were at a Saturday, March 14th, 2020 meeting at her home 2 days before the president announced his 15 days to slow the spread effort. Your now-released diary said the meeting was a week before that. Dr. Birx said you all were trying to trap the president into having no other options. She wrote, your plan was to, quote, block any of the president's escape routes. So, quote, he'd have no choice but to agree to our flatten the curve measures. Yes or no, Dr. Fauci, did you try to block or trap President Trump into the slow the spread, flatten the curve measures in March 2020?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
When the COVID-19 virus broke out in Wuhan, China, you, Dr. Fauci, knew pretty much right away that NIH had funded Chinese labs, including those doing coronavirus research. There's email traffic from early January 2020 where your staff was flagging for you that NIH funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth Alliance. Yet few Americans knew we funded the Wuhan lab because the funding went through a sub-award and was not reported to the public database like usaspending.gov as it should have been. Also, EcoHealth violated federal law by failing to report in its research papers how much taxpayer funding it spent on that research. At my request, the Government Accountability Office helped track down that $1.4 million of U.S. taxpayer money that was sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, both by you, Dr. Fauci, and through USAID. But first, it passed through EcoHealth Alliance, which I helped to get defunded through the NDAA. Dr. Fauci, did you intentionally use subaward funding to obscure NIH funding of Chinese biolabs and coronavirus research?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
NIAID awarded multi-million-dollar grants to a number of scientists shortly after they wrote publicly in the Proximal Origins paper that the COVID virus likely came from nature. Though documents Chairman Paul released last week show in private, those same scientists were much more open to the virus being from a lab. In 2023, Representative Jordan insinuated that you basically gave a $9 million bribe in the form of an NIH grant to NIH-funded virologists to say the virus likely was from nature. Dr. Fauci, yes or no, did you reward the Proximal Origin authors by giving them NIAID grants or contracts?
I decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, we have learned that U.S. coronavirus researchers at UNC shipped, quote, humanized or transgenic mice to China by around 2017 for use in their dangerous coronavirus work. Under your NIAID coronavirus, researchers also used aborted baby body parts in mice research, and taxpayers paid for them to do that. NIH-funded coronavirus researcher Dr. Ralph Barrick and his colleagues at UNC put parts of livers, thymuses, and chunks of human fetal lung that they got from aborted, almost 5-month-old human babies. They put those parts in their research mice. They disgustingly named them BLTL mice and wrote they had created a, quote, sandwich of aborted body parts in the mice. Get it, folks? BLT. A BLT sandwich. Your RML lab employees in Montana also ordered and used aborted baby body parts in their taxpayer-funded research. And emails show how they plan to use those mice for post-COVID work. NIH funded putting aborted babies' fingers and scalps off the heads of aborted babies and putting them into the backs of research mice. The scalps later grew fine baby hair in the mice. They even included those disgusting photos in their research paper that you funded. Not all of those were research on coronaviruses, but some were. Thankfully, the current NIH director has said no more of this. Dr. Fauci, yes or no? Do you think that human aborted parts should be put into mice for coronavirus research?
The advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Mr. Chairman, would you direct the witness to answer the questions that we have been asking?
He probably would if he was here, but I can direct it. But I think we understand his answer.
We do understand that. Americans are asking for accountability, Dr. Fauci, and your silence is very telling. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
来自俄亥俄州一名很年轻的参议员 Bernie Moreno， 他是2年前才进入参议院的。原来他是一个卖汽车的，他开了好多汽车行。他回顾了自己参选的动力，说是在疫情期间呢，他目睹了一位母亲带着孩子们看球，没有戴口罩，结果被逮捕。为了这个呢，他卖掉了所有的资产去参选。
To idiotic politicians who enforce those rules, arrested that mom for watching a football game with her own family outside. When that story broke, I said to myself, I cannot stand idly on the side and watch this happen. It was about 6 years ago today that I decided I'm going to give up my businesses, sell them all, run for office, run for the United States Senate. Here I am sitting in front of you 6 years later saying, who the fuck do you think you were for doing that? It is a total disgrace what you did to this country. And if my Democrat colleagues are standing there defending you, I hope the voters of the United States of America watch the clips of every one of you doting on a guy who was more interested in being a celebrity than saving American people.
Moreno 说完这个话之后呢，还让福奇转过身去看一眼坐在后排的一批受害者。你转过身去看看他们，但福奇呢就拒绝掉头，因为 Moreno 说这不是个问题，只是要你做一下，不影响。但是呢，福奇坚决巨头掉去看那些人。而委员会中的民主党人呢，除了 Pennsylvania 的 Fetterman 之外呢，每个人就发表一通支持福奇、痛斥共和党这样的言论，一个问题也没问。之后呢，他们扬长而去。而 Fetterman 呢，是唯一的一个做出了理性发言的人。我们来看看。
It's not about much more your regrets, but I have one. And that is early on that there was the theory that the virus could have emerged from the lab. And early on that became like a right-wing kinds of theory. And I thought it seemed to make sense. Now, there was a really advanced lab that was close by, and then you have this unknown virus out. So, but that became a very partisan thing. And now it seems now it's more and more emerging theory that would have come from the lab. Now, I think that the next time our nation's facing something like this, we are not become, as I might have been, blinded by the partisan idea that
这次火爆的听证会过后啊，恐怕还有下文。目前已经有一些州政府在考虑是否对福奇发起这个指控，我们会继续为大家追踪报道。那今天的节目就到这里，如果你喜欢我们的节目呢，请点赞转发，谢谢大家支持，我们明天再见。